Okay, hi everybody, and well, I'm back a week later. Sorry, it's been one of those weeks planning for the conference and working on the personal identity profile, which I hope by the time you hear this is well established as something you can use. Today, then, is the 18th of March, and we're on program number 42 here of the externalization of the hierarchy. Just maybe as a little segue, humanity will therefore invoke the spiritual power of the kingdom of God, the hierarchy. The hierarchy will respond, and God's plans will then be worked out on earth. The hierarchy on a higher turn of the spiral will invoke the center of God's will. Shambhala or Shangri-La, notice he's including sort of the westernized version of Shambhala. Shambhala or Shangri-La, thus invoking the purpose of God. Both the will of God and the purpose of God are there found. Thus, he continues, will the will of God be implemented by love and manifested intelligently? For this, mankind is ready, and for this, the earth waits. So now we're ready to go on, and we have April 1944. There was a pretty large hiatus in there of about 2 years where I think the Tibetan was so busy with the rest of the hierarchy that he was not able to respond to the students' work. He had given them plenty of work to do, of course, in that time. About a 2-year period, actually. He gave them certain seed thoughts to work on, and then he was able to come back after a while. Notice that this April 1944, this is 2 months before the June invasion by the Allied forces at Normandy Beach. And that was a tremendous invasion. I think it was June 6th, 1944. And we don't know, of course, what period in April we're looking at here. But suffice it to say, it's very close. So if I have my bracket, and then let's just go on and see what he says. I have written to the world aspirants for many Waysacks now. I have again and again brought to your attention and theirs the close relation which is being established between the world of men and the world of souls. The kingdom of souls, the world which the hierarchy dwells within. I have again and again, he says, pointed out that under the law of evolution, certain great fusions at 1 month or great approaches are taking place. Once again, we're in that position where the higher centers of consciousness and power can influence humanity far more directly, and as we're told, hierarchy again will be visible and walking upon the earth in full visibility and mixing with and interplaying with the normal life of humanity, rather than hidden and recessed and contacted only under special circumstances by those who know how to do so. I have indicated that the present activity, let's see. Okay, I think I'll write here that that'll do it. That the certain great fusions are taking take place. Okay. I have indicated that the present activity of our planetary logos is bringing certain major adjustments within the planetary sphere of influence, and these primarily affect the human kingdom. It seems that the human kingdom is very much the focus. There is a fourth initiation being taken by our planetary logos, a kind of fourth initiation, and as humanity is the fourth kingdom, naturally by numerical resonance, there would be a special focus upon humanity. I've indicated the present activity of the planetary logos is bringing certain major adjustments within the planetary sphere of influence. I mean, a major adjustment would be the movement of the human kingdom, or a certain proportion of the human kingdom, into the fifth kingdom, the kingdom of souls. And that will be enough to look at humanity as if it were not only aspiring humanity, not only disciplic humanity, but in a way, humanity, the initiate of the first degree. I've called to, you see how he does it, he repeats what he has done, and this brings to mind, this is what a good teacher does, tells you what he's going to say, says it, and then tells you what he said. I have called to your notice the urgency of the incoming life, and from a certain point of view, we can consider this the entire inflow of Aquarius. Occasionally, I'm going to get sorry about that, off to the right, a pop-up here or there, but I'm not sure how to deal with it, so I won't at the moment. So I have called to your notice and the urgency of the incoming life. Let's call it the energies of Aquarius in a way. Let's call it the planetary soul. Let's call it the reappearing Christ and his externalizing hierarchy. I've called to your notice the urgency of the incoming life, producing tension, spiritual recognitions of a far-reaching nature. Humanity is now in that condition where these kinds of recognitions can occur as never before, such widespread recognitions. The immediate overthrow of false gods and standards, and there he's hinting at something very interesting, because it's not only materialism that is overthrown, but the ancient Norse gods, in a way, the German gods that it was the intention of Nazism to re-establish. And for some reason, the Tibetan told us that this was a very dangerous process. The immediate overthrow of false gods and standards, and the destruction of outworn and crystallized interpretations called doctrines, crystallized interpretations of the spiritual realities. So, here he has made these thoughts available to us in the foregoing pages. And these are times of crisis and the coming together of many cycles. Now, when cycles of different durations and of different meanings combine in their climaxing, and they intersect each other, or are, let's say, superimposed, you do have a time of considerable opportunity and crisis. By these means, the way is cleared for a new and simple recognition of divinity, which will satisfy not only the heart of the simplest person, but which will meet the need of the most intelligent. And that universal presentation of the meaning of divinity, so that this meaning can touch all strata of the human kingdom and all levels of intelligence, is most important. I have talked in terms of the union of Eastern and Western thought, and of the need for the great civilizations nurtured under the influence of Sri Krishna, the Buddha, and the Christ. Of course, Sri Krishna and the Christ being the same entity from the reincarnational point of view. I've talked about the need for the great civilizations to be brought closer together, because we do live in a time of great fusion. Of course, before the fusion occurs, there's often pronounced lines of demarcation and separation, so one can understand fully the need for the fusion and what it is that is in process of fusing. I have said, and I here reaffirm, that he who comes will make this union possible and effective. This event will evoke worldwide recognition. Now, at this point, we still may be talking about a possible avatar coming. And up to this point in the book, he has not unequivocally affirmed that it will be the Christ who reappears, at least in physical form. We are told, that in 1945 that decision was made by the Christ, which promised a full physical return on the dense physical plane using his Maya Varupa, one would expect, because there's no need to be born or generated in the usual way of human reproduction. So the higher beings have their ways of appearing in person and intangibility, even though, doubting Thomas wondered at it. And when the Christ made known his intention, this was the time when Sanat Kumara released the third great stanza of this so far three-stanza'd invocation. The whole thing is the great invocation, the 1935-36 version, the 1940 version, and the 1945 version. It's all the great invocation, but we tend to call our third stanza by the name the great invocation. And that's what we mean, usually, when we say the great invocation. I've stated also that we are reaching a climaxing period in human history. I suppose whenever there's a potential change of kingdom, as in the period when the highest members of the third kingdom, the animal man of the period, before he was individualized, was emerging into individualization, there was again such a climaxing period coinciding with an initiation of the planetary logos. In this period, the lords of karma are unusually active. We might say clearing the decks, so to speak, so that more rapid progress is possible. Now, this may, of course, cause a lot of intense suffering in the clearing process. The law of cause and effect is bringing the results of past activities, the subjective thinking and the secret impulses to the surface. We might say, under Pluto, and exacting penalty and the planned cleaning of the slate of human history. We might call it a great cleansing apparatus under Pisces in a way, before the new cycle can occur. And when we are dealing with the latter days of Pisces, we anticipate a fresh, resilient beginning in Aries, but we cannot have such a beginning if there are leftovers and great swaths of unfinished business. The business has to be somewhat finished, and when you look at the period of those, the horoscopes of those who were involved in the Second World War, and some of the major henchmen who committed atrocities, crimes against humanity, you notice the prominence of Pluto. I wonder if I can, Pluto in Pisces, let's just say. I believe that was the case. I want to see if I know that for certain. And so we'll go over here and hope that I can find it. And there's a lot of charts here, but I'll go to the dynamic place, and then I will go back by many years. Okay, and that's I'm going to go back to the 1890s, and let's just see. There we are. Okay. Well, it's Pluto and Neptune together, is what I should have said. Pluto and Neptune. That's it. Two rulers of Pisces, and not Pluto and Pisces per se. And they did stay together, especially under Gemini. But I did notice, that some of those who were the liquidators, you might say, of hundreds of thousands of people, they did have a strong Pisces connection. And so Pluto and Neptune would have both been the rulers. So let's see here. Do they come, and Chiron too? That's interesting. So in the 1890s, these two planets came together. Two major rulers of Pisces, giving that sense of finality and, of course, with respect to those that the master race considered the undesirables, we have what has been called that final solution, really a cruel and barbaric elimination of millions of people of different origins and sympathies, especially the Jews, but also the Gypsies and many Slavic people and all those that were considered of inferior race. They were eliminated if the powers could get their hands on them. I think Hitler said at a certain point, I have left a few Jews alive just so you could see how correct I was in trying to eliminate them. Okay, a very material solution, because obviously if reincarnation is true, nobody was eliminated, truly. And the same souls could be born into different races and even into the same races elsewhere. So it was a barbaric and shallow thinking solution, very materialistic. Well, but anyway, this has to do with the lords of karma being unusually active. And the Tibetan did say how many undesirable forms are eliminated during war, and especially these karmically cleansing wars, we might say. I mean, all of that is in the hands of the lords of karma, and very much, I think, in the department of the Manu, and we're not in a position to assess that But it was a great karmic cleansing, and I think many of those who call themselves disciples, experienced a cleansing during that period, a subjugation to certain forces which were drastic in the extreme. The law of cause and effect is bringing the results of past activities, the subjective thinking, even that, the hidden thinking, and the secret impulses to the surface, and exacting penalty, and the planned cleaning of the slate of human history. DK often hints at the idea that very strong spreading of disease will eradicate much of humanity. Pandemics, we're talking about it even now. We're talking about the possibility of pandemics, and humanity may not be in a position to do much about it. Our antibiotics are failing somewhat, and I was reading, the Spanish flu, this probably was all part of the plan in a way. Some people estimate that up to 100 million people died of the Spanish flu after World War I. Other estimates are closer to 50 million. Some may be as low as 25 million, but millions and millions of people in that global pandemic. So we don't see things from the position of Sanat Kumara or from the Lords of Karma, and sometimes very drastic methods are used, as in the case of the destruction of much of Atlantis. We do know, however, from the Tibetan that America, or the United States, was considered the center of the old Atlantean continent, and it remained. So not all of what we call Atlantis, really a global civilization, was submerged under the waves. Exacting the penalty and cleaning the slate of human history. How many times have we been through this? I'm looking at the people now who are suffering from tsunamis and typhoons and great hurricanes, and their buildings are flimsy and their protection is nil. It's all part of this detachment from form, which on a first-ray monadic planet, the Earth, we somehow are forced to learn, and all have undergone these violent deaths, and they're buried deep in the subconscious. Master D.K. tells us, buried deep in the subconscious. And they can come to the surface. He says the subconscious can be whipped up like a boiling, seething pot, filled with boiling, seething liquid. And that's what's meant here. The secret impulses under the surface and latent attitudes that the people themselves would be surprised to see detected. Say, well, I never thought that. I don't have that attitude. And if you dig deep enough, you find things, impulses, long buried, that the present sort of middle consciousness, our normal consciousness, is not aware of. So it's a great psychological cleansing going on, a physical cleansing. We're not done with it yet. When he whom all disciples serve was on earth 2,000 years ago, remember that DK, sometimes I noted that is very interesting. He calls the Christ my master. Normally he's using that type of title for the Master Kuthumi, but he says of the Christ, my Master. When he whom all disciples serve was on earth 2,000 years ago, he said that secret things would be made plain. By this emergence of the good and of the bad into prominence, men will arrive at knowledge, at understanding, and will be forced to take those steps which will be needed to build a new and better world based on the law of love and not on the law of separateness and hate. And this is what is happening today. Now, it was 80 years ago. Okay, this is being written, but not much has changed along this line. So the secret things under Pluto are being made plain, and that which is long hidden in the, at least symbolically or maybe factually, in what we call the lower parts of the aura, those things will emerge. Sometimes when you talk about having the serpent underfoot, the way Mary is said to have done, and as St. George kills the dragon, the wicked serpents you place underfoot, you begin to wonder about the position of these forces beneath the feet within the aura. Sometimes statements are symbolic, and sometimes with respect to esoteric factors, esoteric structures and anatomy, they are factual and not symbolic. I have said also that the forces of light are nearing the earth, and that the hierarchy is coming steadily closer to mankind. And this, we work in the premise that this is so. We work under this assumption. We work for the returning hierarchy, which is charged to reappear, many of them in advance of the Christ himself, preparing the way, even as we must prepare the way. Forgetting the things which lie behind, I will strive towards my higher spiritual possibilities. I dedicate myself anew to the service of the coming one, and will do all I can to prepare men's minds and hearts for that event. I have no other life intention. So we're involved also with much thicker ignorance in the preparation process. And the true disciple connected with Master DK's ashram does assume the truth of this responsibility and, this possibility. It's used as a working hypothesis, and for some, it has become actually a conviction. Okay. These basic events, this is a big review, and I'm always grateful when Master DK conducts one of these reviews, because he's given so much material, it's easy to, in a way, forget where you are. And, you might say, well, look, we're dealing with a book that is very linked to a literal past, a literal historical past, and these events are now long past. But the underlying themes are not long past, and his method is not so much to emphasize the details of the outer circumstances as to talk about the spiritual principles which must be evoked in our lives as we uphold the good and seek to drive away the evil influence. I think first clearing the ethers and then driving those energies back onto the astral plane, and then when the time is right and the forces are sufficient to stand with massed intent, then to clear the astral body of humanity as well. And meanwhile, of course, our own astral body. We can't really say that with a clogged etheric body filled with negative forces, we can do much for the general environment, nor can we imagine that if we are filled with low desire and our aspiration is not keen and love is not in our astral body, that we can do much to relieve the world of the glamours with which it is beset. And it will go on that way regarding illusion and the power of clear and unconfused thought. We have to really be able to see through the lesser interpretations, the lesser mental assumptions that humanity embraces, and we have to see beyond and through those insufficient conclusions. All right, the Tibetan goes on. These basic events, these subjective happenings, and these spiritual determinations under the law of action and reaction, this is the law of karma, right, have evoked, let's just call it the law of karma, have evoked a more rapid response from the forces of evil present in our planetary life than from humanity. It always seems that, humanity is slow to respond. Maybe it just doesn't want to admit the seriousness of the situation and somehow childishly hopes that such situations will just go away. But, I'm looking at the tardiness, for instance, with which the United States responded both in World War I and in World War II. Not until 3 years after war was declared in World War I did the U.S. enter the fray. Not until almost 3 years, 2 years, let's say. Wait a second. No, 4 years. It's 4 years. Not until 4 years after the Allies, the United States allies of England and France declared war, England especially in 1939, upon Germany, did the United States enter the fray. Not until the Pearl Harbor incident aroused them, and the wise guidance of Franklin Roosevelt saw to it that this great neutral nation, imagine the United States neutral, entered the war. So there's been a tardy response, and I guess we can call it, in that respect, a tamasic response, whereas it looks like the forces of evil have a very rajasic response. Certain great forces or embodied energies of darkness and of evil organized themselves and took the needed steps, so they believed, to prevent humanity from stepping onward into the light. Now remember how he describes he doesn't go too far because he tells us that speculation about these beings is fruitless. I think that's the word he uses. It conveys the idea of useless, but fruitless and dangerous. So he simply tells us that there are 6 leaders in the East and 6 leaders in the West. If you've ever wondered about some of those expeditions that German groups, German scientists and anthropologists were sent upon, and taking them to the East, I think it was to try to locate some of these leaders and to gain occult powers, which would assure their victory in the war. And indeed, there were many occult dimensions to their pursuit of the war. So certain great forces or embodied energies of darkness and of evil organized themselves and took the needed steps. So they believed. Obviously, the Tibetan is seeing the positive handwriting on the wall here because he knows now that the war has been won. This is April 1944. Ever since the sun moved northward in 1942, he knew, and the other members of hierarchy knew, that the war had internally been won, and it was just a question of working it out to its final conclusion. Drastic though some of those closing battles were upon the outer plain. And I'm thinking about how the Germans must have looked on at the advancing Soviet forces and the advancing forces of the Allies, the French, the British, and the Americans, and others in their effort. The Germans started a 2-front war, and the war concluded also on 2 fronts with the advancing of massive armies closing in on them. So it was a great destruction. So anyway, these forces, whatever they are, because we don't really have to know anything other than that they exist, they availed themselves of the weaknesses, the selfishness, and the self-interest of man. Just as good can stimulate the latent goodness in man into expression, so evil can evoke greater evil from those susceptible from innate weakness and from the unthinking and emotional. Just as good can stimulate the latent goodness in mankind into expression, so evil can evoke greater evil from those susceptible from innate weakness and also from the unthinking and emotional. This is the power of the demagogues who sweep into their line of feeling, let's call it, those who cannot submit what the demagogue says to intelligent review. The forces of light work only with men's souls. Lies, false teaching, evil propaganda, a war of nerves, the culture of fear, the organization of groups and of isolated workers in every nation, pledged to undermine righteousness and distort the truth, went rapidly forward. Great and fundamental truths were twisted to meet the ends of the evil workers. Yeah. And DK did comment on the idea that so often when there is a new theme emerging, it's the forces of darkness that are first to grasp it and use it towards their ends, like, what did he say? Joy through strength and strength through joy. You know, this kind of mantra that the Hitler Youth um, utilized or were helped to utilize in the early days of training those young men into their hateful orientation. And, the forces of light seem slower to wake up. This just seems to be an ongoing issue. They are not as alert, and even today we may question how alert they may be. So the Tibetan goes on. The doctrine, for instance, of the super race was interpreted to mean the superiority of the German nation and culture to all in the West, whilst the divinity of the sons of heaven, the Japanese race, was emphasized in the East. Yeah, it is interesting that this idea of racial superiority was also seized upon by the Japanese, and they looked upon the members of the fifth root race, who were their antagonists, as racially inferior. And we're told that Hitler exulted when he realized that he could create an alliance with Japan, because he said, here is a people who in war have never been defeated. Now, of course, later, when it all came down to it, had the Germans won the war and the Axis won the war, then there would have been the elimination of the Japanese because of the racial doctrines of the Germans. And there would have been the kind of weaponry, atomic weaponry, which could do it. So, humanity and the planet was spared a hellish future, which would have prevailed had they, the Axis powers, prevailed. Sorry for the occasional pop-up. It will document the history of when this all was made. I'll try to figure out these pop-ups at some point here. The bewildered peoples of both nations were led to believe that they had a great and spiritual mission to dominate the world. Yes, even spiritual, even appealing to their highest ideals. So that, as I told you, the wife of this very, very cruel man, Reinhard Heydrich, who was, let's just say, a member of those who planned the final solution, along with Adolf Eichmann. His wife could think of nothing but that he was involved in a noble cause, and he himself was convinced of the nobility of his cause. So it's certainly possible to fool ourselves and to find the most cruel type of idealism as if it has heavenly roots, which, is the cruelty and the horror of it is unknown to the perpetrator, because they are so deeply wrapped in glamour. So anyway, the bewildered people of both nations, of Germany and Japan, maybe not so much Italy, were led to believe that they had a great and spiritual mission to dominate the world. Hitler often talked of providence, as if providence were God, and providence would be disappointed. Providence decrees that. Providence demands that, He did appeal to that that sense of the greater being or some greater force, because that, of course, would, not only did he believe it, I suspect, but it would bring his people along with him, people in whom the spiritual objectives had not been entirely vanquished or replaced by the domination of the Norse gods. Okay, well, anyway, this was the first result of the approach of the kingdom of God to earth, or rather to the physical plane. In that kingdom, men of all races will demonstrate their divinity. The kingdom of souls will be recognized as the universal home and race of all men. The kingdom of souls will be recognized as the universal home and race of all men. Separative nationalities will, in that kingdom, have no place or recognition. So let's see if I can correct this little problem I'm having here. And stop highlighting. And right. So I'll bring this into a fuller. See if I can do that. I think so. Okay. So such were the glamours under which so many millions labored not long ago, and other glamours are now emerging. Sometimes I said to two yesterday, it looks like the Nazis are back, you know. The idea of the militant superiority of the white race over all others is now espoused by thousands. And they are calling these people white nationalists. Well, you know, it's an exalted form of egotism. It's very little different from what was happening in Germany. The only thing is the experience of the Second World War may have branded itself so deeply into the consciousness of today's now again reincarnated humanity that they will not accept the triumph of those separative, egotistical powers. Some have permanently overcome such tendencies through great suffering and through seeing, you know, what the outcome of the war was. Others have not learned their lesson, and in many respects, we seem to be facing another such war. Some people, you know, are calling it a recrudescence of the Civil War, although it has different opponents, and it's much more difficult to deal with because the people who promote racial superiority simply based upon the racial form are everywhere to be found, and they're not located geographically particularly. There are concentrations perhaps in the South, we might say in the South of, let's say, the United States, but generally it's spread all over the Western world. Those who believe that the white race must triumph and who overlook the possibility that every race will have its great contribution to make to humanity. All of this is in the Manu's department, you know, and what his plans are, we cannot say. But they're, you know, the method of blinded cruelty and superficial thinking is certainly not his method. And, you know, DK talks about a coming race, maybe during some of the millions of years of the sixth root race, where humanity will be of a uniform color or homogeneous color, some golden color, you know, representing the fact that the outer human beings have mixed in a certain way as to produce a uniform race externally. Of course, there will still be these individual causal body differences. The egoic lotus will be developed as it is. Even now, if we would think of people in terms of the development of their egoic lotus and not in terms of their outer appearance, we would go a long way towards overcoming this superficial type of racism. Now, with the races, I'm sure the Manu has much to do and is deciding how to promote the best arrangements, migrations where necessary, interactions where necessary. All of that is in his department, trying to create a vessel for the human soul, which is truly sensitive enough and strong enough to withstand an ever-increasing intensity in the inner aspects of its nature, the inner aspects of the man. But there's a weakness in the human physical frame, and DK pointed to that when he talked about the founding of the new esoteric schools and how they would help to overcome this weakness. So within the Manu, within his knowledge and those of his ashrams, lies the solution. And we just have to, knowing so little as we do, we have to leave it to him and to those initiates and masters that surround him, so that the strengthening of humanity in every way and the sensitizing of humanity in every way can be wisely achieved. The forces of evil, here we are on page 425, and I think we began, where did we begin? 423 or something like that? Not long ago, yeah. We're not making a whole lot of progress here. At least, I think maybe I'm talking too much, I'm not reading enough. The forces of evil sought for those leaders and groups who are the materialistic correspondents to the spiritual leaders and those who seek to guide humanity along right lines. Whoa. This is very interesting. And, as we've been told, that great battle in India had the same leaders. They took possession, and I use this word with deliberation, of the evil men who led the Axis powers. Hitler, Tojo, Goebbels, Ribbentrop, Himmler, and to a much lesser degree, Mussolini, Hess, Goering, and others. I think if you ever notice Rudolf Hess speaking, you'll see, this is utter fanaticism based on true belief. He was a very sort of quixotic man who parachuted into England carrying a kind of a self-originated idea for peace between England and Germany, and he was locked up for the rest of his life, But not Mussolini, not Hess, Goering, and others, but interesting that Ribbentrop should be included among the really evil ones. Tojo and Goebbels, you expect, when you find out what Himmler's ideals were, you expect that to As for Streicher, outwardly very evil, it seems. Maybe he's included here among the others. I don't know. Sometimes when I look at his effect, it seems that he belongs with the first of them, the first list. They completely overpowered the minds of these men, already distorted with ambition and sadistic inclinations. They, the six in the east and the six in the west. All right, so they completely overpowered, they possessed these evil, ambitious men, but evil maybe in the normal way, and they added to that evil their ancient evil. Who, you ask, do I mean by they? I mean those intelligent, evil. Notice how the third ray is accented there. It's, the monad is probably the third ray, and the souls of all of them, DK says at one point, have the first ray or maybe the first sub-ray. I mean those evil, intelligent, evil, unloving, hateful individualities who are to the world of selfish and material focus what the hierarchy of masters working under the Christ are to the struggling human aspirants. Well, okay, that's who they are. That's another description of them. They still are here, and the door where evil dwells has not been entirely sealed. It's been left ajar. And these individualities, they work with such stealth, that one does not suspect that they are at work. And therein lies their power, because they are not exposed. Who, you ask, do I mean by they? I mean those intelligent, evil, unloving, hateful individualities, notice a capital I, who are to the world of selfish and material focus what the hierarchy of masters working under the Christ are to struggling human aspirants. These students of the hierarchy, of course, are struggling upward. And the students, or what can we call them? The pawns of these evil individualities want to pretty well conquer and be master in the outer world. At least that's their focus at the moment. The power of these evil forces is enormous, for they recognize no restrictions or ordinary decent human limitations. They work, what are they called? Lords of, are they lords? Anyway, they are characterized by wicked pride and hateful lust. Ugly words, but they fit here with how they are being described. The powers of these evil forces is enormous, for they recognize no restrictions or ordinary decent human limitations. They work through violence, coercion, cruelty, hate, terror, and lies. They aim to subjugate the human consciousness through the complete control of men's minds, something, of course, that is never allowed to the student of the White Brotherhood, or to the White Brotherhood itself. No one is allowed to sway a brother's mind, we remember, but they do and want to and do, through the withholding of good and the promulgation of evil. They aim to subjugate the human consciousness through the complete control of men's minds, through the withholding of good and the promulgation of evil. They stimulate the brains of men through the extent of their evil and magical knowledge. So there is very knowledgeable occultism involved here. It's not that they simply will what is ill, they have the knowledge to back it up. He says, I mean this literally and physically. So actually, the men mentioned up here, they were taken over. And it was their own tendencies which made them an easy and attractive target in this possession. Obviously without the help of the hierarchy, humanity would have gone down to defeat, no question about it. Only the Lords of Liberation saved the day. So now what do we have here is about 1 hour has passed. 1 hour and 1 minute. The Great White Lodge, working under the inspiration of the Christ and of Shambhala, functions necessarily under certain spiritual restrictions. Coercion is not permitted. In other words, as Moria says, you're never allowed to hit with your arrow, but that arrow can be plutonic, the center of will in another. The will must be left free. They are not interested in producing automatons. Free will determines whether the potential aspirant will follow the great way of light or not. Coercion is not permitted. The minds of men must be and are left free. The stimulation of the souls of men is permitted because it results in the stimulation of the expression of love and of understanding, leading to right human relations. So we see, in a way, that the forces of light are working under an initial handicap, though in the long run their methods prevail. And maybe we can say that is why their students seem to respond so slowly, and wake up too late, well, almost too late, and why the students, the minions, the pawns, the expressions of the forces of darkness wake up immediately. They are much attuned to the methods which know no restrictions. So the Tibetan goes on, these spiritual restrictions greatly slow down the progress of the forces of light. That's interesting. It should interest you to remember that the length of the war was partly dependent upon the inability of the armies of the Lord to commit the crimes for which the Axis powers have been responsible. They just could not find in themselves such brutality. The physical activities of the forces of light do recognize certain limitations, and of this the forces of evil take constant advantage. The bombing of the mass populations was started by Hitler and could have been ended by him immediately if he so chose. But, later it was a matter then of self-defense and of stopping the advance of evil, and Germany suffered great affliction under the bombing of the German cities by the Allied forces, especially, I think, England, and then later France to a degree, I don't know, but because, France was still under occupation. And I've seen the documentaries when America made its way through the Normandy invasion into France and toward Germany, and the bombing then was carried out also by the American forces. Well, very cruel means were used. The horror of the war. War really is hell. And the great dramas, the films, the plays, and so forth have come forth and shown us what a hell it really was, even if we were not immediately participating in it. There is another aspect of this matter to which I would like to call your attention. These restrictions which the forces of light recognize have also an undesirable effect where the unintelligent and well-meaning are concerned, and where those who are emotionally polarized interpret the law of love. The United Nations, he's not talking about the organization which emerged, but the union of the nations fighting the Axis powers. The United Nations working for human liberation and freedom, and therefore working under the law of love, rightly understood, is prevented from following the lines of indiscriminate cruelty which characterize the German and Japanese techniques. Unbelievable torture, really. Torture, starvation, lying propaganda, misuse of prisoners. Under that, so much of a horrific nature is covered. The dissemination of a terror campaign. These are not permitted by the rules of the Brothers of Humanity. From a certain purely physical angle, this can be interpreted as putting the armies of the Lord at a disadvantage. It is this right attitude on the part of the forces of light which has an undesirable effect upon the appeasers and the pacifists of the world. These would, for humanitarian reasons and from love of the forms through which humanity functions, bring the war to an immediate end. Well, those were not going to work, those methods, and it's possible to be slowed down by those who are well-meaning, but superficial in their thought. This was happening in neutral nations, I think in India. It was certainly happening for a time in the United States, and the Nazis, well, Germany and India have similar rays, 4 and 1 and 1 and 4, reversed, of course, and both of them have the Aries soul. There was a commonality there, and the Nazis were making inroads into India through its pacifistic orientation. Interesting that Gandhi, who was in charge at that time, had such a strong Libran influence, opposite the Aries indications in the soul chart of both. So the Libra was interpreted as peace at any price. And he had, certain things on his mind. If Britain was being weakened through the war, then the chance of India throwing off the British yoke was increased. And so, in his view, the defeat of Britain may not have been a bad thing for India. Well, it's far more complicated than that, but Gandhi was not universally praised by the Tibetan or by Churchill, those who were solidly in the ranks of those fighting the Axis powers. And so much of his doctrine, nonviolent resistance, has been accepted as valuable, and it is valuable. But at that moment of decision, there was not a joining in with the forces of light per se. A moment of crisis, and there was not the acquiescence of India to that crisis. So anyway, because the forces of light have to hold back and are not allowed to use the hatefully cruel methods of the forces of darkness, then certain appeasers and unrealistic idealists advance their doctrine, which would actually, if followed, lead to the victory of the Axis forces. It's a principle that we have to apply in today's world as well. This war between the dweller and the angel of humanity is not over. And I sometimes think we've seen nothing yet. This is the year 2019. So were the armies of the Lord really at a disadvantage? Well, maybe he says from the purely physical angle, and I would say in the short term. These would, for humanitarian reasons and from love of the form through which humanity functions, bring the war to an immediate end. Well, this looks to me like, let's see if I'm correct in this, in favor of the Axis. In their well-meaning blindness, they would sacrifice the future of humanity and the lives of millions of people at a later date, indeed, because they would be eliminated as undesirables and as enemies in the way of the all-dominant Germany and Japan at first, and the lives of millions of people at a later date for a temporary cessation of hostilities. I'm reminded, there's a wonderful film, Lincoln, and a great actor, Daniel Day-Lewis, having contributed so much of unique depth and variety to the cinema. He was playing the part of Lincoln, and it seemed that the southern states, when they realized that they were being beaten, were sued for a compromise and for a cessation of hostilities, which would at least allow them to continue their way of life. But just as the Tibetan advised that a complete and unconditional surrender needed to be pursued by the United Nations, by the Allies, as it were, so Lincoln demanded the complete surrender of these forces in the South, which were in process of being beaten, And when you kind of look at it, the North-South relationship, we shouldn't make too much of this, but the North-South relationship is a bit like the states above the diaphragm, the Mason-Dixon line, excuse me, and the forces below. Certainly any group of people that insists on retaining that convention we call the enslavement of any race or of any peoples cannot be seen as promoting the spiritual advancement of humanity, and that is what the southern states at that time demanded. And there's an echo of that even now. And following their defeat during the war, there was the preservation of many hostile attitudes towards a more enlightened point of view coming from the North. Now, this, does not indict many, many people who, whether North or South, were either for the good or for the bad, But it's a generalization. So they would, in their well-meaning blindness, talk about the disadvantages of the sixth ray having gone too far into the impractical heights. They would sacrifice the future of humanity and the lives of millions. Of course, all the undesirables would be eliminated naturally. What Germany considered to be the undesirables, apparently that's not part of the plan, and DK in some writings talks about the role of the Jews 500 years forward from the time he was writing it. So, maybe now 400 years forward or 400 and some. It's not intended that all Jews be eliminated from the face of the earth, the heredity involved there, nor of many other people who he considered to be undesirable. And as I said before, it wouldn't be long before Germany deemed the Japanese as undesirable, or maybe the Japanese as sons of heaven, if their leaders had prevailed, would deem the Germans and all members of the white group undesirable. So it's just a situation that's based upon extremely limited and superficial materialistic thinking. Of course, Hitler could make his theorists say anything he wanted them to say, and they twisted many, many doctrines, and probably if the doctrine of reincarnation had emerged widely, there would have been a way to twist it so that only certain souls really deserve to be saved or deserve to re-enter, whatever, Let's just say that the twisting of the truth, the distortion of the truth, one of the major liabilities of the glamorous state of mind was more than alive and well in the so-called scientific researches of the German groups that were dispatched under Hitler to make a case for Nazism. I would emphasize, says the Tibetan to you, that the forces of evil must be defeated now. The evil leaders must be wrenched from their high place, and the coming defeat and annihilation of those responsible for launching this horror on humanity is an absolute necessity and a bounden duty if security, well-being, and a new world order of happier living is to be the lot of the coming generation. So we notice, the Tibetans' first ray thought in this matter. No compromise here. These forces must be driven back. And, and when you see the way certain people kind of disguise themselves at the end of the war, either as a laborer or a house painter or whatever, these people in very high places seeking to sneak out from under the gaze of the Allies, disguised as ordinary Germans. You realize that they had indeed been wrenched from their high place. Others chose a different form of exit. Goebbels, Hitler, probably Hitler, unless you believe that sort of South American destination of Hitler. Goebbels and his whole family, and maybe others, they chose the suicide method. Others were captured and hanged. So indeed, wrenched from their high place. And the whole idea of war crimes really came to the fore with the Nuremberg trials. The scene of so many super impressive rallies where the imagery and the philosophy of Nazism was advanced so strongly that the mass of people in attendance were just overwhelmed by the pageantry and the sense of their own destiny and their own greatness, their own inflation. They were inflated to believe that they were far more than they were, and pride was there, and exaltation at the final recognition of their true nature. We have to be careful about those who wish to exaggerate or minimize. This is the method of glamour. In narcissistic personalities, we have a great exaggeration of self-worth, bombast, megalomania even, Hitler, megalomaniac. After the war, or as it was drawing to a close, he concluded that Germany was not worthy of him. So he had been a victim of the most severe type of glamour. So there must be a complete defeat, and I think we have to remember this, a complete defeat and annihilation for those responsible for launching this horror is an absolute necessity and a bounden duty, launching this upon humanity. We have to, in a way, work with the lords of karma in such a cleansing. I think the re-education of such personalities in the same incarnation is pretty well hopeless, but who knows what methods may come about. Master Moria speaks of he has certain elements of occultism in his work that bring things in from a different angle than the Tibetan does, and he speaks of a brown spot being prepared on Saturn for the worst of the evildoers on Earth. Is he being literal? Is he being symbolic? It sounds like he's being quite literal, and he's allowing a certain piece of occult information to escape into the general cognizance. A temporary ending of the war, says the Tibetan, would only give time for the forces of evil to reorganize, and the future war would be infinitely worse than this one. Well, probably we cannot conceive of that unless Germany indeed had the atomic bomb. This is the intelligent humanitarian. The intelligent humanitarian is saying, and this is the opinion of the hierarchy. The hierarchy stands firmly on the side of those who demand a war to a finish, and the reasons are the ultimate saving of millions of lives and the preservation of certain basic spiritual values. So we definitely see, don't we, that the hierarchy has taken sides, definitely. As it must, if the human race was to be saved from an inevitable enslavement. The issue is far more serious spiritually than you know. And we might even say, and here he speaks in April of 1944, even after the sun has moved northward, guaranteeing at least for this phase of the war, the ending. The issue is far more serious spiritually than you know. He did talk about Germany as that unhappy land in which no real occult endeavor could be pursued. No occult school would appear. I wonder if his thought is the same now. with the transformation of Germany into a modern European state, which, if anything, is not seeking the usual kind of dominance, but is much more cooperative. Of course, one might ask whether there is the seeking of economic dominance, but it's a different Germany now, isn't it? Responding much more to its fourth ray soul. Interesting about the Axis powers, the strength of that fourth ray. Japan, the fourth ray soul. Italy, the fourth ray personality and the sixth ray soul. Tokyo, the sixth ray soul, fourth ray personality. Berlin, other energies. The fourth ray of struggle, of warfare, of resolution was strongly in effect during this most recent world war. Nothing like it has appeared again. A kind of Cold War took over for a while, subsided, now seems to be arising again as human fear at the greater possibilities rises in the consciousness of those who foresee what? The loss of what they are familiar with. So it's too early to know, but I think students of occultism understand what they must do to promote soul values widely. The issue, I'm kind of fixated on this sentence somehow. This is, has this been overcome, this statement, or are we still here? The issue is far more serious spiritually than you know. The work of the hierarchy is handicapped, not only by restrictions under which the forces of light must work, but also by the work and utterances of the silly little men with small vision, who see not the future possibilities if the war came to an inclusive finish, and who, for the present comfort of the present generation, would sacrifice the children of tomorrow and later generations. So this is creating this serious situation. Sometimes I think, when I look at humanity today, that spiritually, even though there's not a precipitation of a world war, there is a serious internal situation with the rising again of those forces which plunged humanity into the horror of the Second World War. Well, let's see here. So this is 1944. The war came to an end just about 1 year after this was written. That has to be understood. So it must have been a very internally powerful year. The war came to an end about 1 year after this was written. The work of the hierarchy is handicapped by the attitudes of men with no perspective and much selfishness, of no cruelty, but of stupid thinking. These men in the houses of legislature in the various nations, in parliament, in Congress, and in churches plead for the cessation of the war before victory is won and before the enemies of humanity are beaten to their knees in supplication for mercy and in a demand for peace. They see the end of business as they have known it. They see the familiar landmarks of their comfortable world disappearing. This is the pacifists, I believe. They dislike the results of the war as it affects them. or they cannot bear the general suffering, and prompted by pity, they demand an immediate peace. Others, prompted by isolationism and the desire to withdraw from participation in the misery of war, maybe the United States there. Others hate those whose duty it is to carry the war to a successful climax. I mean, obviously the materialistic state of mind would be active here, and the main values would be considered to be material. No real knowledge of the inner life. And so many people think that if they simply believe in a Savior, they will go to heaven. What do they care about making things better here? They would sacrifice, others hate those whose duty it is to carry the war to a successful climax, or see their particular ambitions threatened by the conditionings of a changing world. They would sacrifice future generations, as I have said above, to their short-sighted policy and feeble judgment. They spread disunity, therefore, and shackle the hands of those administering in high places. Their efforts prolong the war, dishearten the fighting forces, break down national and military morale, and lay a poor foundation for the work of the post-war world. There are many of these in every nation. There are too many in the United States of America. There are none in the USSR, and hence her triumphant march forward. I think, there would not have been the conclusion of the war as it happened unless we had had Russia very, very strong on the eastern front of Germany. And this the Russians know, but the Americans seem to forget. So he wants to get rid of the forces of obstruction, which are coming from within the ranks of those who mean well and are not cruel. They're just, stupid, he says, short-sighted, possessed of feeble judgment. These are not complimentary words. And they prevent. It reminds me of the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo is so high, so excited in his love of Juliet that he sees love everywhere, even in his former enemies. And as a result, in a battle between his former enemy Tybalt and his close friend Mercutio, he interferes, and Tybalt kills Mercutio under Romeo's sword. Romeo broke up the fight, and Tybalt lunged for Mercutio and slew him. And then, of course, Romeo, in a rage, slew Tybalt, and on we go with the great battle between the two noble houses. So, by being well-meaning and by wearing rose-colored glasses and failing to look at a dire situation realistically, we can hurt our friends and we can hurt humanity. So sometimes severe action is needed in order to be harmless, as the Tibetan tells us in various places. Does this apply to today? I think it does. the years leading up to 2025, when the great conclave occurs, will be a particular target of the evil forces who wish to prevent a positive outcome of that meeting, which will basically, in a way, launch the practical aspects of the externalization of the hierarchy and the reappearance of the Christ. Now, while these forces of evil don't know the details, and hierarchy does much to prevent them from registering what the details of their plans are, it does know the basics, just as we do. And obstruction, obstruction, obstruction. These will be the methods used now by those who love the personality far more than they love the soul. You have consequently in the world today the forces of evil working through Germany and Japan. Notice he doesn't mention Italy. To date, they are holding their own and they are not yet defeated. Well, they're holding their own, okay, but then came these great tank battles and the advancement of the USSR and the driving back of the German forces at least, and battles in the Pacific theater, which kept routing the Japanese from the islands that they possessed and so forth. So there was a steady moving back, but as the Tibetan says, they are not yet defeated. They are terrorizing the world within their own national borders. They do not possess enough people with courage, understanding, or the ability to think clearly, who hate evil and who can hold to a vision. There is little in either nation to bring assistance to the forces of light. The Germans were deceived from the beginning, and a widespread national deception backed by a terror campaign argues a general weakness. Well, this is the Pisces personality of Germany, of course. A general weakness, lack of courage, and a natural predilection for evil guidance. The tendency to be led along aggressive, selfish, and evil lines has been characteristic of the German nation for a great length of time. I wonder what he means. Centuries, I suppose. This negative nation, with its arrogant psychology, one of the great paradoxes of the ages. Of course, there you have the Aries soul being appropriated by the Pisces personality, and you have the first ray personality of Germany strengthening, stiffening the often weak Pisces influence. This negative nation, with its arrogant psychology, one of the great paradoxes of the ages, must be taught the ways of positive good, and a courageous championing of righteousness must take the place of the present negative acceptance of evil. Well, I think some of this emerged after the war, and there have been strong humanitarian leaders in Germany. With humility and intelligence must the German nation be taught to take a proper place in the community of nations. All right, so that much is Germany, so let me deal with it here. Working through Germany and Japan. And now he'll talk about his assessment of Japan. Yeah, they are not yet defeated. I think what I'll do here is just make this a different color. Okay, here we go. I'll make this into the yellow color, because then he begins to talk specifically about Germany. Of course, it's so easy, with Pisces that sign of gullibility to deceive the one conditioned by that sign. They fell into glamour immediately. And probably from some kind of general strange inferiority complex. The Tibetan, he might mention that somewhere. Superiority and inferiority going hand in hand. Pisces producing the inferiority complex. The first ray inclining towards dominance and an attitude of superiority. First ray Aries, even though it's fourth ray Soul, but it's a sign of the first ray, again inclining towards dominance and arrogance. So it's quite a contradiction, which befits a nation with a fourth ray Soul. So a natural predilection for evil guidance, and maybe for centuries, for a great length of time. So obviously longer than the formation of the modern nation under Bismarck in the late 19th century. So there's a paradox going on here. The Japanese nation, in spite of great age, must go back to the nursery, into the nursery state. It must be taught, as children are taught, to be social and not antisocial. And it will be long before it is safe to trust this nation. Here we are, 80 years later, and are we in the period when, according to the Tibetans' point of view, Japan has entered into a condition where it may be trusted? Or, though the world may trust Japan, is it not the point of view of the masters? The Italian nation presents no greater problem than does any other nation in the world. It is normal, as are the United Nations. The German nation and the Japanese race, notice how he discriminates there. It's not so much, he doesn't use the word race when it comes to German. Interesting. The German nation and the Japanese race are not normal and must be brought back to normality by careful, kindly, but firm handling and by applied educational processes. Well, how much has been done? From a certain perspective, it seems that much has been done, and of course it is the responsibility of the masters to see whether, from their perspective, whether that which is necessary has been done. But sometimes he makes it seem that a much longer period of time is necessary than the 80 years or so which has elapsed. Not quite 80 years, really, but since the end of the war. So what do we have, 70, 75? Maybe more like 75 years. Okay. Then the forces of light. Okay. I would here correct an impression which exists among esotericists. By this phrase, the forces of light, they are apt to mean that the hierarchy is literally fighting against the Axis nations. This is not so in the physical sense. The hierarchy works, as you well know, with the souls of men, and with those minds which are so oriented and disposed that they react to soul impression. So, when I use the expression the forces of light, I mean those enlightened nations upon whom the light of freedom shines and who will refuse at all costs to relinquish that light. There is no freedom in Germany or in Japan. In a lesser sense, and for a brief time, There was no freedom in Italy, but Italy must be counted among the enlightened nations. After all, think of the Renaissance and Italy's pivotal role there. That's just me inserting that point. For it could not be held in duress, and the resistance in Italy overcame the fascist powers. The forces of light comprised those nations working through their armies and in the diplomatic area who are today fighting for the freedom of humanity, for the eternal rights of man, for liberty of conscience, for the position of the individual in any nation, and for freedom of religion, or the right of man's self-chosen approach to spiritual realities. Behind these nations stands the hierarchy. Okay, well, I think what I'll do here, just who are these forces of light? Okay, not the hierarchy per se, see, not always the hierarchy, and not always the high sources mentioned in the first stanza of the great invocation, let the forces of light bring illumination to mankind, not those forces of light. So we just have to, be aware of the context. So we have first the forces of evil, and I'll, sort of increase the size of that title. I wonder, through what nations now today the forces of evil are working. They are working, and there's said to be a triangle representing evil between the United States, the Middle East, where in the Middle East, and a point in Central Europe, which he does not specify, probably for very good reasons. Perhaps trying to see whether the evil there cannot be overcome by natural means. Okay, so this is how he's looking at the meaning of the forces of light in this context. Behind these nations stands the hierarchy. Okay, and let's put it in here. Behind the nations deemed as the forces of light. Freedom is the birthright of mankind, and free will is the highest of the divine characteristics. Freedom is misinterpreted and misused by many owing to the point in evolution of the mass of humanity, but it is a fundamental divine principle, and where principles are involved, the hierarchy knows no compromise. Oh, that's really an important statement. There is no spiritual principle behind any of the activities of the Axis powers. They're working, in the realm of materiality and ruled by a great Deva who is not, or through whom no planetary principle expresses. We have to go to the etheric nature before a planetary principle will express in any, in any systemic sense. And from a cosmic perspective, the entire 18 or 21 subplanes is not principled. There is no spiritual principle, either, let us say, systemically or cosmically, behind the activities of the Axis powers, behind German activity or Japanese aggression. Why doesn't he use the word aggression there? Well, the Japanese were amazingly aggressive during the Second World War. Therefore, the hierarchy does not stand with power or strength behind any of their efforts. Does not stand. And hierarchy is working within, of course, with the souls of men, but in other ways as well. And I'm going to make this very big because it's very important. Where principles are involved, the hierarchy knows no compromise. So let's really take that in when we decide how we will behave. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing that we might be able to finish this, not exactly at the 2-hour point. Humanity as a whole, then, okay, humanity as a whole. So there are 3 groups, the forces of evil and the forces of light and humanity as a whole. The men, women, and children of the world are all implicated in and affected by this universal war, planet-wide war. The effects reach into the most isolated village, the most extensive desert, and the highest mountaintop, as well as into the cities and congested areas of all nations. No one is exempt from the consequences of this present catastrophe. The bulk of humanity are universal and innocent sufferers. The majority scarcely realize what it's all about. They view this great historical climax from a purely self-centered angle and from the point of view of how it affects them as individuals and their nation as a whole. An increasing number are coming to realize that this war must be fought to a successful finish because there is no peace or hope or right world relationships as long as 2 nations, one in the Western Hemisphere and the other in the Eastern, can precipitate disaster upon countless millions. Yeah. So this is how the trend of human consciousness was proceeding at this time. A minority are realizing that the war has precipitated the condensed evil of the ages and that humanity is faced with the opportunity of erasing past errors, ancient selfishness, and ingrained wickedness, and of inaugurating a new and better world. I suppose he means, the intelligentsia and especially the disciples, aspirants, and initiates. They realize the real origin of the war, and all of this material about the occult roots of the war probably would amaze the average, even thinking human being, and he would consider it to be, fantasy. In this new world, there will be freedom of approach to God, opportunity for individual expression, freedom to live in right relations, and scope for creative living. So this is actually part of what just went before. And I will use it as such. Okay. A very few, know that this is a climaxing point in an ancient conflict between Christ with his hierarchy of masters and spiritual wickedness in high places. A mere handful of knowers and disciples know, past all controversy and discussion, that heading up those unhappy lands, Germany and Japan, are ancient leaders who have again sought to bring planetary disaster and to deflect the ends of the Great White Lodge. So we are replaying, in a way, the Atlantean War, and only a few know this. So these are the different degrees of awareness of the roots and significance of the war. All the way from the strictly personal response, the misery of one's own life without knowing or caring what the whole thing is about, to those who know exactly why the war was precipitated and who the leaders really are, and the fact that this is a replay of a huge battle at a time when Shambhala actually intervened in the affairs of men. Above, among all these are thousands who stand bewildered, sensing the truth but feeling helpless in the face of the gigantic horror which the evil gang now ruling Germany has precipitated upon humanity. The evil gang now ruling Germany. Okay, these people, these thousands, these bewildered ones, they tend to right thinking but are still the prey of the unscrupulous and selfish. When their thinking has been guided into right lines through a process of right presentation of the situation, they will constitute a powerful asset to the forces of light. Now, we do witness, even now, people who have power through their vote, but they are subject to demagogic manipulation. We find this in various countries. We find it notably in great democracies of the time, which is ironic somehow. The people who should know better do not, and their thinking has to be guided into right lines through a process of right presentation of the situation. And then they will really back the forces of light. I think right now, humanity stands at a real point of decision. I'm talking about 2019, and here it is, March in 2019. And if incorrect decisions are made, it will be noted, perhaps with surprise for some, how rapidly disintegration of hierarchically fostered unities can fall apart. I'm speaking of the United States. I'm speaking of the United Kingdom, especially. Those gatherings that have the Retu soul, which is the soul of the Christ, the soul of the hierarchy, and will be so important in the externalization of the hierarchy, a Retu body, a heart center, and the reappearance of the Christ. So the forces behind all of this internal chaos proceed by the ancient dictum, divide and conquer. And so far, it looks like their success in bringing about division is significant. Now, we're just at that point. Let me just say that 2 hours have passed, but I see that it's not long before we finish this section. So, despite the fact that it will be an irregular program of irregular length, I will proceed. Such is the situation with which hierarchy and humanity are today faced. The strength of the forces of light is growing. Well, it had to in order to bring the war to the right conclusion. What can we say of today? The power of the forces of darkness may be waning, but is still vastly strong upon the physical plane. Their main hold is upon the minds of men. and that is exceedingly potent and unweakened, for it is aided by the mild, unthinking person, by the bewildered, the pacifist, the appeaser, the isolationist. The idealism of this group is turned to the aid of Germany by the skillful, evil workers. Was it Irkutsk? Was it that big tank battle in 19... Let's see if I can get here, and by any means. And, okay, so this is a tank battle, decisive, 1944. Okay, and tank battle. What was the decisive battle? Maybe I better leave out the word decisive. Okay, so tank battle, 1944. Russia, USSR defeats Germany. Yeah, roots of the war. Okay. What battles did occur? Well, I'm not doing too well here. Okay, here it is. It's Kursk, the Battle of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk was a Second World War engagement between German and Soviet forces. 1,910,361 men, 5,128 tanks, 25,013 guns. While the Red Army counterattack was defeated and the first defensive belt breached, let's see what it says here. This is the Wikipedia. You know, it's useful. I do believe the battle was the final strategic offensive that the Germans were able to launch on the Eastern Front, and let's just say Kursk Oblast, Russia. And what was the result? Soviet victory. Axis loses ability to initiate strategic offensive operations. The Soviet Army gains the initiative over the German Wehrmacht. Okay, and Soviets regained territory along a 2,000-kilometer front, and some very powerful German generals were involved there, but above all, Georgy Zhukov, he amazing general. So it was between the Soviet tanks and the Tiger tanks of Germany. And while not getting into all of this, this was a decisive battle. And when did it? July and August, looks like, 1943. So really after this document was written. So the powers still vastly strong, and the Germans they have skillful workers in darkness. The German armies are still unbeaten. Central Europe is a mighty fortress dominated by the arch enemy of mankind sitting on his mountaintop. And this is interesting, of course, because the idea of Central Europe is still where a potent point in the triangle of evil that today affects humanity can be found. Now, it's not necessarily Germany. In other words, the Tibetan has left it ambiguous for a purpose. The German armies are still unbeaten, Central Europe is a mighty fortress dominated by the arch enemy of mankind sitting on his mountaintop. And I think Hitler's lair was the Berg something. I'm trying to, is it Berghof? In other words, Berg means mountain. There, symbolically, he is to be found the initiator into evil conditions and into slavery, the enemy of humanity. The armies of the Lord stand poised, and victory will be theirs when there is complete unity of purpose, concentrated attention upon right human relations, and a spread of idealistic aspiration to all who are fighting this battle for freedom. For this unity of purpose, all the enlightened people of the world must work. It is not yet adequately present. Okay, this is how the Tibetan sees it, and you think about the tremendous effect that such generals as Patton, leading the advance from the West, had upon the morale of his men. So this is the very thing when DK speaks of aspiration. Well, this is it then, friends. Let us now turn to the work of the hierarchy and to the event for which all initiates and disciples are now preparing, the coming Wesak festival. Okay then, so here we are, and we will begin with externalization of the hierarchy, program 43. We don't know how long it will last or when it will begin. It won't begin today on the 18th. And it's been about a week since we've been able to do anything. So let's just see if something can be done before I have to go to the United States in about a week. Well, here we are immersed in the decisive drama in which humanity was engaged 75, 80, 85 years ago. It was, says the Tibetan, an Armageddon. And the Agni Yoga people have said the same. It was an Armageddon. Others look forward to an Armageddon in the future, not thinking of this Second World War, the end of the Great War, as an Armageddon. Time will tell, and one can, tend to look at the Tibetans' estimation and give confidence to it. Of course, it doesn't mean that Armageddon ended there. We may still be in the battle. It depends how things emerge, and if they emerge onto the outer plane, we will see. Okay, lots of love to everybody, and many blessings. Study hard, meditate with depth, and proceed, persist. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.